Welcome to the Feminist Exec, the podcast where women in leadership share their stories, challenges, and triumphs. I'm your host, KP, and together we'll dive into the real talk behind breaking barriers, leading with impact, and redefining success on our own terms. Get ready to be inspired, empowered, and equipped to take your leadership to the next level. This is the Feminist Exec. Let's forge your future. Welcome to the Feminist Exec podcast. I'm your host, KP, and I'm excited to have Erin Horst with me today. Erin works as a technical consultant for Elanco Animal Health, where she provides product support to dairy providers throughout the U.S. Erin also has an extensive educational background, including a PhD, which is pretty impressive, if I do say so myself, from Iowa State. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you so much for having me, Kate. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. So I know our listeners are going to want to know more about your background and your career history. Give us a little bit about what that is and how you got here to where you are today.
Yeah, sure. So I would say if you had asked me when I was even 18 years old if I would be doing what I'm doing today, I definitely would not have thought I'd be here. As you mentioned, my role today is working as a dairy technical consultant. So I grew up in a swine farm actually in Iowa, but my interest was largely on the companion animal side. So I went to school like a lot of young kids thinking I was going to be a veterinarian and focus on companion animals. And throughout my undergrad education, I actually started to get really interested in nutritional physiology and the biology behind that. And I happened to have a professor that I was taking the class with who I really admired his work. And I went up one day and I said, "Hey, I love your class. How do I learn more? How can I do more of what you're doing?" And from there, I got involved in his research lab, and that really changed the trajectory of where my career went from there. So at the time, we were focused a lot on dairy cows, which in particular have really unique biology, especially around the time that they give birth and start to produce milk. As you might imagine, that's a pretty energetically demanding process. And so she has to shift her metabolism in extreme ways to be able to make that milk. And so I really fell in love with that biology in that space. And so from there, I got interested in continuing my education towards a research path as opposed to going down the veterinarian path. And I decided to stay at Iowa State and work with that professor throughout my graduate career. And in that time frame, I got to take a deep dive into that space, understanding how the immune system works, how immunometabolism works, which is integrating two of my passions, the immune system and metabolism. So it was really exciting. And from there, it's been something that I've been able to directly apply in my career, except for I'm having a more direct impact on the dairy producers today. Obviously, with any field, when you're in academia, you have a huge impact, but you might not see that impact for 10 to 15 years or even longer because you're paving the way, right? Mm-hmm. And when I'm in industry and the role that I get to do today, my impact is a little bit more here and now. So I'm actually helping these producers make changes on their operations in the moment that can change both how those animals, the welfare of those animals, but also the economic profitability of those dairies, which we know is also an important thing for those individuals to continue that career path for themselves, but also for their families.
Wow, there's so much there about what you do, particularly around, the female cows and supporting the industry and making sure people are healthier and happier. Makes me think of, I recently watched a documentary about Temple, I forget her last name, the autistic woman.
Grandin.
Temple
Yep.
Grandin, that's right. That was a fascinating documentary, by the way, but makes me really think about the health and the safety and the well-being of the animals really does have a downstream impact on the ultimate product that they have for us as humans, which is all the dairy products. Super valuable and interesting. So what does a day-to-day life look like for you? Technical consultant, I know you've gone and done presentations and speaking gigs and stuff all over the world, which is pretty awesome. But what do you do from a day-to-day perspective?
Yeah, I'll give you the short answer first that probably everyone says, which is every day is unique and different, right? And that's what makes the job so rewarding. So I do get the opportunity to go give presentations at different conferences talking about the new science that's coming out in the space. But I also get to directly interface with our customers, whether that be what we call the nutritional consultant, who is ultimately formulating the unique diet that we feed to our dairy cows, or working directly with the dairy producer that has that hands-on approach with the cows every day. And so the customer aspect can be really rewarding because you're talking about those conversations of how we take those concepts and apply them in the real world, which I love. But I also love being able to talk with other academics and formulate new ideas and new directions of where we go. I would say one of the things I love most about my job is that the ultimate goal is not to go out and share a bunch of fancy scientific words, right? No one in our industry needs to know the technical terms. What they need to know is what is the concept and how do we whittle it down to actions that we can implement. And that's what my goal is every day, is to make science understandable and be able to make a difference.
That's a huge lift, especially as a woman in STEM. It's pretty awesome to see you being able to do that and kind of translate the academic stuff that you've been doing into real world stuff that the everyday person maybe doesn't see, but can appreciate. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I love it.
So
Very fun.
other than you mentioned the transition from, either the research side or the field side, has there been another pivotal moment in your career that you think has made an impact on it?
Yeah, so I would say in terms of pivotal moments so far for me, it was really about putting myself in a position that challenges me every day. So, I came into industry into a small organization where I was able to work with a great group of passionate people, but I wasn't necessarily being challenged to what I felt my potential could be. And, it's really easy to sit back and think, oh, well, my job's easy every day. I feel comfortable, but we all know that comfortable isn't necessarily good, right?
Yeah.
Going outside of your comfort zone really challenges you to be better. And I think we all need a little bit of that. Even when it's uncomfortable in the moment, you get better. And so to me, recognizing that there was this opportunity to further grow and to go into a more competitive space made a huge difference on my goals and what I've been able to do. Like my new position gives me that opportunity to go speak to producers in Poland and to go to different conferences all throughout the US and have those conversations, which has been super fulfilling.
That's awesome.
But yeah, it's not easy decision in the moment, but has been instrumental, especially for my personality and challenging me to grow.
Yeah, it makes me think of a piece of advice that I've heard a lot recently, actually. So I was on one of our ladies group chats, and one of the topics that came up was getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, because it's in that space that you really see the most growth. And so kind of looking for opportunities that make you uncomfortable intentionally because you want to see that growth, because you want to put yourself in a more challenging position.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think that's huge. I mean, you're never going to know your potential unless you just keep saying yes, right? You look for that next opportunity, even when you don't feel ready. You don't have to have all the answers. That's been huge for me. My graduate professor in school always told us that, leave your pride at the door, walk into every opportunity eager to learn, and you're going to go so much further in life. And I think walking into those uncomfortable spaces allows you to do that.
That's interesting. So you mentioned your graduate advisor. Have you had mentors or other mentors in your life, or was that your mentor? What role has mentorship played in your career so far?
Yeah, I think it's a huge part of it, right? You hear it all the time. Who you know is as important as what you know, right? To some extent. And I would say one of my primary mentors was my graduate professor. He still is someone I communicate with at least a couple times a month. And he's always there to help myself and my teammates within graduate school be successful in our careers. I was very fortunate to work with him because he is well known in our relatively small industry. And that takes you places, right? Having that name behind you helps. You still have to live up to that potential, but networking is huge. And I think even beyond my graduate professor, my peers within graduate school have been influential in my career as well, because those are individuals that I get to work with now every day in a completely different dynamic, right? Now they're my customer in this scenario rather than being my peer. And I think it's been a lot of fun to see that dynamic shift. And I think you should always remember that the world is small and how you treat others will impact you down the road, even when in the moment it may not seem so.
That's so important. The golden rule, treat others as you wish to be treated, because it does come back around. That's
Yeah.
really fascinating. So I'd like to learn a little bit more of how you define success. What does success look like to you in your role, but also in life?
Yeah. For me, success is really less about an individual contribution. Of course, I want to do my best every day and show up, my best self. But to me, being successful is being part of a great team that can make a big change, right? It's never an individual that makes the biggest changes, right? It's how a team can work together. I would say great examples are when we can work in a collaborative environment and implement change, like I said, on a dairy farm, right? Where we can actually see the long-term impacts that has on the health of the animal, on the profitability of that dairy. And so I think to me, that's what it is, right? Is being a part of a team where you challenge one another and they challenge you back and everyone grows together. So I think that's where it is for me.
That's awesome. We chatted a little bit before this about kind of the change and the dynamics in the dairy industry and how the number of women in the graduate programs and in school is dramatically increasing, and that's kind of changing the environment that you're working in. You just mentioned kind of working with peers that are now your customers. How does that shift in, dynamics change how you work every day? Do you see it as changing the industry as a whole, or is this your personal program experience?
Yeah, I think the industry as a whole is definitely shifting. Has been traditionally a very male dominated field, no doubt, and remains pretty heavily in that direction. It's not uncommon to go to conferences where 95% of attendees are male versus female. But just as you alluded to, yeah, that's changing every day. And I don't think we're necessarily even seeing what that impact is going to be yet, right? Those programs, that higher education piece certainly is actually female dominated. So I'm really excited to see the direction it goes. I can't predict the future, but I know it's going to be that shift, and I think it's going to be positive in a lot of ways.
So you mentioned that dairy industry as a whole is fairly male dominated. I can easily imagine that. It's the traditional, the agriculture sector of the United States. So have you had any unique challenges that you faced as a woman, a younger woman in the field coming in? And, what are those challenges that you faced?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it can be hard to be taken seriously as a young woman in this field. You come in, especially when you're bringing concepts that are new and challenge our traditional beliefs, which has been something the graduate program I was a part of. That was a big focus of ours, is we're really trying to change the narrative of how we've typically approached that transition cow, that cow that's about to calve, and how we think about her. And so the concepts that we're bringing forward are already challenging, right? It's already saying, let's not continue with the status quo. Let's think about this differently and approach it differently. So that's already a challenge. But coming in as a young woman, I think there is that additional barrier, because you have to fight a little bit harder for your beliefs, because you may be taken a little less seriously at first. And that's going to vary, right? It's definitely not the standard rule of thumb. Not every individual treats you differently, but you're going to come across those people that just don't take you quite as seriously. And so to me, my approach to navigating that is just being prepared, right? I am not someone who's going to walk into a meeting and have we'll see how it goes approach to it, right? I'm going to be prepared. I'm going to have my ducks in a row, and I won't have all the answers, but I'll know what I need to get across, and I'll follow up with the answers I can't address in that moment. So I think being prepared goes a long way. And I think in some senses, as a woman, you may have to have that a little bit more in order than others,
Yeah.
especially in a male-dominated field.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important piece around being prepared and having the information, and making sure you're not caught off guard, right? I think we were talking about earlier what the standard expectations are about men versus women, and how women typically only apply for a job if they're like 100% prepared for that job or have 100% of the qualification. And sometimes men statistically apply for jobs that they're 50% qualified for. And you were sharing an example of a woman that you've watched move into leadership recently. What impact do you think that that's going to have on other women within your immediate circle and within the company or the industry as a whole, to see more women using their hands in those situations?
I think that is huge, right? You have to have those people that push the boundaries, that say, look, it is just because it hasn't been the traditional sense within this organization doesn't mean that that's how it's going to be, right? We have to have those pioneers that move forward and say, no, I am qualified and I do have a lot of value I can bring. And I'm inspired by those individuals, right? Because they do pave the path for us. And it's getting more important that more of us women are raising their hand, right? Because the reality is, who's coming into this industry, they are going to be more women. And so when they see that success path, I think it's really going to change things at a much faster trajectory than would otherwise happen. So I think it's fantastic to see that change.
So when you're looking at examples of women like that in leadership or in different roles, what do you look for in a leader that you admire to kind of develop in yourself?
Yeah, so to me, a leader is someone who doesn't only think of their individual contribution, right? I think the best leaders are those that feel they have success when the team succeeds and they look out for the interest of their team. I think if you're only focused on your individual contribution, you fail to see the overall potential that can be achieved. So I would say that's number one for me, is just having that initiative of if my team succeeds, I succeed too, right? We all have to contribute, but it's not about an individual. I would say a leader that I would admire is someone who is always seeking to help their team be better too by providing that feedback. We all can get better at what we do, but we don't know where we might struggle unless someone has the nerve to point it out, right? Nobody likes to have uncomfortable conversations, and no one really likes to hear what they're not doing right. But when you hear it, you can grow. And I think, I'm very fortunate to have my supervisor be that type of individual who's always helping me get better and acknowledge where I might be limited in some respects and how I can get better. So I think feedback is such a huge part of being a good leader, and really not even just looking from their perspective, but also asking others to share that feedback with you. Because we all know we don't interact with our direct colleague the same way we might interact with our supervisor or our supervisor's supervisor, right? So you want to know how you come off to all of your peers. So I think that's huge.
That goes back to the getting comfortable with being uncomfortable piece where we started, like being okay with getting that constructive feedback so that you can improve on yourself, but also as a leader, being able to provide that constructive feedback. Yeah, I love that. What particular do you have, like a leader that you look up to or a role model that you really admire? Who are they and why?
Yeah, actually, so I've had a really unique opportunity that someone that I attended graduate school with, I actually work with today in my career. We have a pretty small field and a pretty small industry, so there's a lot of overlap, but to be able to directly be on a team with that individual now has been pretty amazing. She was 3 years ahead of me in the program, so I worked with her first as when I was an undergrad and she was in grad school. Then we were in grad school together. Then we both went down slightly different industry paths and ended up back together today where we are.
That's so awesome.
It's incredible. And I've got to see, she's a few years ahead of me. And throughout all of that, I've got to see how impactful she is. We grew up in similar environments where, typical Midwestern household, it's a little bit hard. Confidence sometimes is perceived in a negative way. but I've seen her take that narrative and change it and be like, hey, being confident and powerful is a good thing. And you can go far when you demonstrate that skill set. So for me, seeing her do that, it's been huge. And she's helped me along the way. She's helped me say, hey, here's an opportunity where you have the desire to never say no, but here's one where you should consider saying no. And here's the reasons why. And this is why, your individual contributions are impactful. I think she helps me with some of the imposter syndrome, right? She's a huge advocate for me understanding what my contributions are.
Yeah, there's so much in just that example that I want to unpack a little bit, because one is the representation matters, having somebody in a leadership position that you can see the path. Two, I think, is that ability to interact with someone that's on the same career path and you can kind of see yourself go through, but also kind of lend a helping hand on the way down. And then number three is that imposter syndrome, which I think all of us have, even those of us with PhDs like you, have the
Most
imposter
definitely.
syndrome, which is real. How do you overcome things like the imposter syndrome in your day-to-day work?
Yeah, I would say leaning on your peers a little bit, right? You need to understand your individual contributions, and I'll definitely get to that piece. But I think for me, it helps to ask others, like, how do you think I'm bringing value, right? Can you help me understand where I've helped you or you've seen me help others, right? Just having that feedback piece, it can be so powerful. And you don't always have to ask for it, right? When you work in an environment or in a company where that kind of feedback is encouraged, it goes a long way. I think that's an important part of company culture, is creating a team where people feel like they can share how an individual helped them. It can have a huge impact on those employees and how passionate and effective they are in their jobs. So I think leaning on your peers to help understand your strengths and weaknesses. And then I think too, it's, you and I kind of talked about this when we were preparing for this, it's think about what you've done, right? List out those contributions, those individual contributions, and you start to realize, hey, I do have an impact on how this company succeeds. And, I feel like I've sensed myself doing that more and more. When I start to doubt myself, it's okay, but here's some awesome things that I was able to accomplish. And, often they aren't individual contributions, team contributions, but you played an integral part in them.
As we talked about imposter syndrome and ways to get over it, I was telling you that one of the ways that I do that is I literally pull up my LinkedIn profile or my resume and I say, I've done all of these things, and I kind of have to give myself a little bit of a pep talk that I'm not just, starting out anymore. And I really do know what I'm talking about after being in the industry for a long time. In your case, having the educational background and experience that you've had, which is amazing.
Mhm.
So switching gears a little bit to women in the workplace, there's some stats out there that have shown that there's more and more women who have chosen not to have children in their careers, kind of the child-free by choice movement. Myself have an opportunity to work with women that are child-free by choice. I am as well. How do you think that is impacting maybe your career, or women in the workplace, whether there's a bias towards child-free or bias towards women with children? I think that's a big topic right now.
Yeah, I think it is a huge part. And the team that I'm a part of has traditionally been more male dominated. And now, as it's shifted to be a bit more equal in terms of female and male representation, the young female group are all in that similar state, right? Where we are currently without children, at least, and potentially will continue down that path, child free by choice. And I think that helps, right? That I'm in an environment where others have made similar decisions, but it's definitely a change, especially in the field that I'm in, right? Agriculture tends to have a lot of the traditional belief systems where it's a little bit hard to understand why anyone would choose that path. But yeah, I think that one's a little tricky.
Yeah, I think one of the key challenges is that there seems to be bias either way, right? If a woman chooses to have children and take time off of work, there's a bias by those that are left behind that she's falling behind in her work and she doesn't deserve. And there's statistics behind that show that both the pay and the promotions progress of women that have children falls behind women that don't have children. But then on the flip side, there's also the conversation of women who choose not to have children taking on additional work of those that do have children because they don't have the soccer games to go to, and, you might have a vet appointment or something, but it's perceived as not as important as, a child's event or something like that. And there also could be negative stereotypes associated with women who are seen as cold or barren. I recently read a book called Off with Her Head, which talks about women in politics and leadership positions, and how if you're damned if you have a child and you're damned if you don't. Because if you do, then you're perceived as not being serious enough in your career. And if you don't, then you're perceived as being, uncaring or not female enough. So it's an interesting journey, I think, that some of us are on to figure out what that line is. Do you see any of those trends that you've come face to face with in your day-to-day or with women that you've talked to?
Yeah, I think especially the point on maybe what today in a lot of millennials, where we may treat our dogs more as children. I think that's and that point particularly is one where I relate to, right? Because to me, my dog is my child. I see him as just the same and I treat him much the same, right? So to me, it's I don't like to leave him alone for prolonged periods of time, and I don't want to just leave him behind when I'm going to explore new things. And I think that in particular can be very difficult to communicate because while traditionally many don't view dogs as the same excuse, I think a lot of us do today. And I think it's very difficult to draw that line, right? Where, hey, I understand that to you it's not the same as a child, but to me it is. And I think there's the same requirements for that dog as there is for a child, but it's very difficult to communicate that to other individuals. And I think that's a huge challenge.
Yeah. I've heard a saying of plants are the new pets and pets are the new kids for us millennials, which I'm seeing more and more often. But I think the beauty of having conversations like this is that we drive awareness around equality and equity, where as a feminist, I believe you have the right to choose whichever direction you would like to go, and you shouldn't be punished for having children or not having children. Everybody should be treated equally. Our male colleagues probably aren't having to have the same conversations because whether my husband has a child or a dog, it doesn't matter to his colleagues. And I'm sure it's the same with your male colleagues and your husband as well, which is interesting.
Definitely. I think that is a huge piece of it.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting one for me is one we spoke to is how quickly you are aged as a woman.
Yeah.
You're 31 years old. You're almost out of your years to be able to have children even. And it's something, again, that, our husbands would never go through. Mm-hmm. Well, you're already 35. Your years are behind you. And that just doesn't happen to the same extent, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, I recently had someone ask me if I was planning on having a mini me, and I said no. And they said, well, you're not that old, are you? You still have time to change your mind or whatever. And I was like, well, no, but my husband's older. And they were immediately like, oh, okay, we respect that. So it was an interesting kind of like dialogue where like the burden is put on us versus our husbands maybe. And if my husband doesn't want kids, then that's fine. But if I don't, that's, a different conversation. But I think it's a sensitive discussion because what if you say that to someone who can't have children and that's all they want, but they don't want to share the details of their fertility journey more publicly? So I think leading with a little bit of empathy when people ask those questions, particularly in a professional environment, is probably something that we should all do.
Yep, I agree with that. Yeah.
Switching gears a little bit on your, personal growth and motivation, what's next for you? What are you looking to continue to grow in your career? And what's next for Erin?
Yeah, great question. I think for me, I have so much potential within my current role to grow, and I'm really focused on that in this next 5 to 10 years is how do I perfect what I can bring in the role that I am. I love the role I have because I directly interface with customers. I get to share on new research and I get to answer and ask new research questions down the line, which I find to be like pretty much the dream job, right? You get to learn so much every day in this role. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to grow and develop within this space. And that's really where my focus is. I think the leader question or the entering into that leadership position is something that I'm intrigued by. I like people. I like helping others grow, which I think is an exciting way that you can benefit people as a leader that I'd love to explore. And particularly in those individuals that are in the role I'm in today, right? And helping them to be their best. So I don't know if I've got it all figured out yet, but certainly I think there's just a lot of growth opportunity within my position today.
So much more to contribute to the industry. And I love thinking about the fact that the dairy that is coming to us downstream is being impacted by someone that I get to know, which is pretty cool to think about. Wrapping up, what is a piece of advice that you've either gotten that really sticks home to you or that you believe in that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, so I think I've touched on it a little bit, but I do want to reiterate it. And that's, leave your pride at the door. Don't be afraid to walk into a situation that you may not be comfortable with. Challenge yourself every day to try to learn new things. Don't stick with what you know. And I think with that, just being willing to say yes. When that opportunity arises, try it out. See if you like it. You can always pull back in an opportunity that isn't a right fit, but you won't know unless you try. So I think just continue to push yourself. Don't get stuck in what you know.
And on that, those are such great parting advice. Thank you so much, Erin, for being our guest today. Again, Erin Horst, she's a technical consultant for Elanco, and she's got a PhD, which I find so incredible. And she had some great stories to tell today. So thank you, Erin.
Thank you very much.
That's a wrap on this episode of the Feminist Exec. Thank you for tuning in and being part of the conversation. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. A special thank you to our composer, Peter Legault, for the original music. I'm KP, and this is the Feminist Exec. Until next time, keep leading, keep rising, and keep forging your future.